Yeah, so in general, when we start looking at training stress, remember, like, we're always going to have a relatively fixed amount of time to train. And then in determining whether you should take more of a higher intensity approach to training or a lower intensity approach to training is always going to be dictated by the total amount of time you train. So if you have less time to train, you're going to probably bias more towards high intensity versions of training, because you want to keep the training stress relatively high in your programming, and you can afford to keep your training very relevant and more specific to your actual goals. Whereas once we start increasing the amount of training time, we want to reduce the training intensity to facilitate that higher training volume. And then kind of like when we look at the two extreme approaches of training, where we can take the high intensity approach, and usually in those cases, we're only going to increase volume very slowly over time, as is necessary to facilitate further progress. Whereas when we go to the other side of the extreme, when we go the extremely high volume approach of training with relatively lower intensities, we're only going to increase intensity as is necessary to facilitate further progress. When we're taking really high volume approaches to training, it's never going to make sense to add more volume to the program, because we already have ample amounts of it. So if you're already training multiple hours a day, you're going to get less additional benefit by adding more hours to your training. Whereas if you're already training at several hours a day, your intensity for a lot of those sessions, or for at least some of them, is going to be relatively low. So you're better off just kind of increasing those minimum intensities that you're training at over time. And likewise, the opposite is going to be true for high intensity training programs. So I hope that kind of like clears that up in terms of like the high volume, high intensity debate. Just keep in mind, like, the primary determinant of which one you're going to use and which one's going to be more appropriate for you is always going to be the total amount of time that you spend training every week, or whatever your average amount of time that you spend training every day would be.